I thought this was just another rich family story. Until this happened. Maid. Bridge. A river full of sharks. And a billionaire standing close enough to see everything, but too far to stop it. What happened on that bridge wasn't an accident. It was the moment one woman's cruelty finally showed its true face, in front of the one person she never expected to be watching. By the end of this story, you'll understand why people say the ones who smile the sweetest sometimes hide the coldest hearts. Stay with me because this one is real and it's not what you think. Hey everyone, welcome back. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop your country in the comments. I'd love to see how far this story travels. Today's story is about a hard-working woman who was never given the respect she deserved, a powerful man who almost missed the truth right in front of him, and one moment by the water that changed 3 lives forever. It's emotional, it's shocking, and I promise you won't see the ending coming. Let's get into it. Nobody ever really looked at Grace Bennett. Not because she wasn't worth looking at, but because in the world she worked in, people like her were supposed to be invisible. Grace was 34 years old, and for the last 6 years, she had worked as the head housekeeper at Hartwell Estate, a sprawling property on the edge of the Combahee River in South Carolina, just outside a small town where old money and new money mixed like oil and water. The estate belonged to Michael Hartwell, a 34-year-old tech entrepreneur who had built a logistics company from a garage into a billion-dollar empire before he was 30. He was the kind of boss who said thank you to the mail carrier and remembered the names of everyone's kids. People in town liked him. People in town respected Grace too, though not everyone in Michael's world did. Every morning, Grace woke up at 5:15 a.m. in the small house she rented 15 minutes from the estate, made breakfast for her 8-year-old son, Elijah, and drove him to his grandmother's before her shift started at 7. She had once dreamed of a very different life. Years ago, before a shoulder injury ended her career, Grace had served as a rescue swimmer in the Coast Guard Reserve, pulling people out of dangerous currents up and down the Carolina coast. She didn't talk about it much anymore. That life felt like it belonged to someone else now. Someone who hadn't yet learned how small the world could make you feel. Michael's fiancée, Victoria Lang, had a different opinion of Grace entirely. Victoria was 30 years old, beautiful in the practiced magazine cover way that made people stop and stare, and she came from a family that had been prominent in South Carolina society for 3 generations. To the guests at Hartwell Estate, Victoria was warm, witty, generous with her smile. But behind closed doors, when no one important was watching, her voice changed. Got sharper. Colder. Grace, honey, she'd said just that morning, watching Grace polish the silver in the dining room. You missed a spot. I know reading isn't really your thing, but the instructions are right there on the card. Grace hadn't missed a spot. She never did. But she'd learned a long time ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially not with someone who signed her paychecks by proxy. She simply nodded, picked the polish back up, and kept working. The estate was buzzing that week. In just 3 days, Michael and Victoria were hosting their engagement gala. 300 guests, a live orchestra, string lights strung across the lawn all the way down to the old stone bridge that crossed the river at the property's edge. Locals called that stretch of water Shark Bend. Bull sharks were known to swim up from the coast into brackish rivers like the Combahee, especially during the warmer months when the tide pushed hard inland. Everyone who'd grown up nearby knew not to wade in past their ankles when the water was high. The Hartwell family had put up a small sign near the bridge decades ago. Strong currents. Do not swim. Nobody had ever needed more warning than that. Grace was setting up flower arrangements near the study window that afternoon when she heard Victoria's voice drifting through the open door, low and tight, talking on the phone to someone Grace couldn't identify. I don't care what it takes, Victoria was saying. I need this handled before the gala. I can't have anything or anyone ruining what I've built here. Do you understand me? Grace froze for just a second, arms full of white roses, telling herself it was probably nothing. Wedding stress. Vendor problems. It wasn't her business. But something about the tone in Victoria's voice, flat, calculating, nothing like the syrupy sweetness she used in public, settled uneasily in Grace's stomach as she carried the flowers down the hall. She had no idea in that moment just how right she was to feel afraid. By Friday morning, Hartwell Estate looked like something out of a magazine. White tents lined the east lawn. Caterers moved in and out of the kitchen like a well-rehearsed dance. Grace had been on her feet since before sunrise, and by noon her lower back ached in that dull, familiar way it always did during big events. She didn't mind the work. She minded the way some people treated the people doing it. At exactly 1:40 p.m. a guest, an older woman in a wide-brimmed hat who'd arrived early to help oversee the details, knocked over a full glass of red wine onto the white marble floor of the foyer. Victoria appeared almost instantly, gliding down the staircase in a robe, hair half-curled, and before Grace could even grab a towel, Victoria's voice rang out across the entryway. "Grace, on your knees please before it stains. Honestly, this is why I told Michael we needed professional help for tonight." The comment landed exactly where it was meant to, in front of 6 other people, all of whom looked away awkwardly, none of whom said a word. Grace knelt down and cleaned the floor without looking up, her jaw tight, her hands steady. She'd learned long ago that dignity wasn't about how people treated you. It was about how you carried yourself anyway. Michael wasn't there to see it. He'd been in his study all morning on calls with investors, apologizing to Victoria between meetings for being buried in work during wedding week. He loved her, or believed he did. Victoria had a way of making him feel like the center of the universe when they were alone together, and Michael, for all his success, had never quite learned to notice what people were like when they thought no one important was watching. As the afternoon wore into evening, guests began arriving in waves. String lights flickering on along the garden paths, a jazz quartet warming up near the reflecting pool, laughter drifting across the lawn. Grace worked the edges of the party, refilling trays, guiding lost guests toward the restrooms, doing the 100 invisible things that make an event feel effortless for everyone except the people making it happen. Around 8:30, as the sun dipped low and orange over the river, Victoria found Grace near the kitchen tent. "I left my grandmother's bracelet in the guest house by the bridge," she said, voice pitched sweet enough for the caterer standing nearby to hear. "Would you run and get it for me? It's on the vanity. I'd go myself, but I really can't be seen in these shoes on that gravel." Grace glanced toward the river. The tide had been coming in hard all evening. She'd noticed the water rising against the old stone pilings when she'd walked past earlier, the current pulling harder than usual, dark and restless in the fading light. It wasn't dangerous to walk across the bridge. People did it all the time. But something about the request, and the particular way Victoria's eyes lingered on her just a beat too long, made the back of Grace's neck prickle. "Of course," Grace said anyway, because refusing wasn't really an option, and because she told herself she was imagining things. She walked the stone path down toward the water, past the string lights that thinned out the farthest she got from the party, until the music behind her faded into a low hum and the only sound left was the river moving beneath the old bridge, dark and swollen with the tide. She stepped onto the bridge. And behind her, quiet as a held breath, she heard footsteps on the stone. Grace turned, expecting to see a guest, maybe someone lost looking for the restrooms. Instead, she saw Victoria. No longer smiling, no longer performing for an audience, her face lit strangely by the string lights behind her, something cold and unreadable in her eyes. "Victoria," Grace said. "I was just going to get your—" She never finished the sentence. Victoria closed the distance between them in 3 fast steps and shoved both hands hard into Grace's shoulders. Grace's foot caught the low stone railing, and for one suspended second, the world tilted sideways. The string lights, the dark tree line, the black water below, before gravity took her and she hit the river hard enough to knock the air from her lungs. The cold swallowed her whole. From the garden, nearly 200 yards away, Michael Hartwell had stepped outside for air, phone in hand, scanning the crowd for Victoria. He saw movement near the bridge. 2 figures, then 1. And something about the shape of it, the suddenness, made him stop mid-step. He saw Victoria straighten up at the railing, alone, looking down into the water. He started running before he even understood why. Underwater, Grace's training took over before her fear could. Years of Coast Guard drills lived in her muscles even now. Don't panic, find the surface, orient yourself. And she kicked hard toward the moonlit shimmer above her. Her head broke the surface and she gasped, choking on river water, the current already dragging her downstream faster than she could fight. That's when she saw it. A dark shape cutting through the water 30 feet away, a fin slicing the surface, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Help!" Grace screamed, the sound tearing out of her raw and desperate. "Somebody help me!" On the bridge, Victoria hadn't moved. She stood at the railing, watching, her expression unreadable in the dark. Michael broke through the tree line at a dead sprint, and what he saw stopped his heart cold. Victoria standing calm at the railing, Grace fighting for her life in the black water below, a fin surfacing again closer now, 20 feet 15. "Grace!" Michael's voice tore across the water as he ripped off his jacket and shoes, and without a single second of hesitation, dove off the bank into the current. "Michael, don't!" Victoria started, but he was already gone, swimming hard toward the spot where Grace had gone under again, pulled by the tide. The cold hit him like a wall. He forced his eyes open in the murky water, kicking down, reaching, until his fingers closed around fabric, Grace's arm, and he hauled her upward with everything he had. She broke the surface coughing, choking, barely conscious, and he wrapped an arm around her chest, kicking hard for the shallows as the current fought him for every foot of ground. Behind them, something brushed against Michael's leg in the dark water. Solid, fast, gone in an instant, and pure adrenaline carried him the last 10 yards to the muddy bank, where he dragged them both up onto the grass, lungs burning, hands shaking. Grace wasn't breathing. "No, no, no, come on." Michael tilted her head back, pressed his palms to her chest, and began compressions with hands that had never once, in 34 years, done anything like this before. "Come on, Grace. Come on." On the bridge above them, Victoria still hadn't moved. And for the first time since he'd fallen in love with her 2 years ago, Michael looked up at his fiancée's face and felt something inside him go completely, permanently cold. 'Cause he had seen it. All of it. She hadn't slipped. She hadn't tried to help. Grace's chest heaved upward, and river water spilled from her lips as she gasped back to life, Michael's hands still pressed against her sternum. His own breath coming in ragged sobs of relief. That's it, Grace, stay with me." Guests had begun spilling down from the garden by then, drawn by the shouting, and within minutes the quiet elegance of the engagement gala had dissolved into chaos. Someone calling 911, someone else wrapping a jacket around Grace's shaking shoulders, the jazz quartet falling silent as 300 guests in cocktail attire stood frozen at the edge of the lawn, staring down at the scene by the river. Victoria reached the bottom of the bridge steps just as the first siren echoed in the distance. Her face transformed now into something Michael almost didn't recognize. Tears welling, hands pressed to her mouth, every inch the picture of a horrified bystander. "Oh my God, is she okay? I saw her lose her footing, I tried to grab her, I couldn't reach her in time." Victoria's voice cracked exactly where it needed to, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "I've never been so scared in my life." Michael said nothing. He knelt in the mud beside Grace, holding her hand as the paramedics pushed through the crowd. His mind replaying the 15 seconds he'd seen from the garden on a loop he couldn't stop, Victoria's hands on Grace's shoulders, the shove, the stillness afterward. But 15 seconds from 200 yards away in the dark. Was he certain? Truly, completely certain. Doubt is a strange and powerful thing, especially when it's protecting you from a truth you're not ready to hold. "Sir, we need to move her now," a paramedic said, gently but firmly guiding Michael back as they lifted Grace onto a gurney. An oxygen mask fitted over her face, her eyes fluttering, unfocused, searching the crowd until they landed briefly on Michael's. She pushed me, Grace whispered, so quietly only he could hear it. Then her eyes closed, and the paramedics wheeled her away into the flashing lights of the ambulance. Victoria's hand found Michael's arm. "Baby, you're freezing, let's get you inside." He pulled his arm away, not violently, but enough that she felt it. Enough that, for just a moment, the mask on her face slipped, and something sharp and calculating flickered behind her eyes before the tears returned. "I need to go to the hospital," Michael said. "Of course. I'll come with you." "No." His voice was quiet but final. "I need to go alone." At Coastal Regional Hospital, Grace was stabilized in the ICU. Mild hypothermia, a concussion from striking the water, 2 fractured ribs from the impact of the fall, and lungs that had taken in more river water than any doctor liked to see. But she was alive. She was going to live. Grace's mother arrived within the hour, Elijah's small hand clutched tightly in hers. His face pale with fear as he peered through the ICU window at his mother lying still beneath the tangle of monitors and tubes. "Is Mommy going to wake up?" he asked. Michael, still in a hospital-issued sweatshirt, his own dress shirt ruined and forgotten somewhere on the riverbank, crouched down to the boy's eye level. "Yes," he said, and meant it with everything in him. "She's one of the strongest people I've ever met. She's going to wake up." He stayed in that waiting room until 3 a.m., long after Victoria had stopped calling, staring at nothing, turning over and over in his mind the 15 seconds that had just ended his engagement. His sense of the woman he loved, and everything he thought he understood about the last 2 years of his life. Grace woke up 2 days later to soft morning light and the steady beep of a heart monitor. Her throat raw, her ribs aching with every breath. Elijah was asleep in a chair beside her bed, a blanket someone had draped over his small shoulders. And in the corner, sitting quietly, still in the same borrowed hospital sweatshirt, was Michael. "You came back," she rasped. "I never left," he said. "Not really." Over the next few days, as Grace slowly regained her strength, Michael visited every afternoon, sitting with her for an hour at a time, saying very little, just present. It was during one of those quiet afternoons that Grace finally told him the truth about that night on the bridge. Every detail, the phone call she'd overheard days earlier, Victoria's cold voice at the railing, the shove that had sent her into the current. Michael listened without interrupting, his jaw tight, his hands clenched in his lap. "I saw it," he finally said. "From the garden. I saw her push you. I've spent 2 days trying to convince myself I imagined it." "I didn't." Grace watched him carefully. "Then why hasn't she been arrested?" "Because right now, it's my word against hers, and a story about you slipping. I need more than what I saw in the dark from 200 yards away. I need to be sure, not for me. For you." There was something else too, something Michael hadn't expected to learn until his own mother's old friend, Eleanor, stopped by the hospital with flowers and let slip a detail that changed the shape of everything. "Bennett," Eleanor said thoughtfully, looking at Grace's chart on the door. "You know, that name always did remind me of Miriam Bennett. She used to work the grounds at Hartwell decades ago, back when your father ran things, Michael. Sweetest woman. Left rather suddenly, though. There was some kind of falling out with your grandfather over property lines, if I recall." Grace went very still. "Miriam Bennett was my mother." The room fell silent. Michael sat back slowly, processing the strange, quiet weight of it, that Grace's family and his had crossed paths on this same land, 1 generation earlier, in circumstances no one had ever fully explained to him. His grandfather had never spoken of it. His father, before he passed, had only ever said the Bennett family, left under difficult terms, and changed the subject. "I don't know the whole story," Michael admitted. "But I intend to find out." Grace shook her head slowly, exhaustion and old grief mixing in her expression. "My mother never talked about this place. Not once. She worked here for 6 years and I never even knew until she was gone." She looked out the window at the parking lot, the ordinary gray sky. Maybe some things are better left buried. Maybe, Michael said. But some things need to come up for air eventually. Just like you did. It was the first time Grace had smiled since the water. Small, tired, but real. Back at Hartwell Estate, Victoria had spent those same days working the phones, calling in favors from her family's attorney, quietly suggesting to anyone who'd listen that the poor woman had clearly been disoriented, that the water had been higher than usual, that accidents happen on old properties like this all the time. She sent a generous, tasteful flower arrangement to the hospital with a card that read "Praying for your full recovery," and made absolutely certain the local paper's society column mentioned her devastation over the terrible accident at our engagement celebration. She had no idea that, 3 miles away, a groundskeeper named Curtis had just remembered something important. Curtis Alvarez had worked the grounds at Hartwell Estate for 11 years. And he'd learned a long time ago that the safest thing an employee could do was see everything and say nothing. But 11 years of silence started to crack the moment he heard Victoria telling guests, for the 3rd time that week, that Grace had lost her footing in the dark. Curtis had been repositioning the string lights near the boathouse that night, close enough to the bridge to hear raised voices. Not words, just tone, sharp and sudden, followed by a splash and Michael's scream a moment later. He hadn't seen the push itself. But he'd seen Victoria standing alone at the railing afterward, not screaming for help, not moving, just standing there. When Michael quietly pulled him aside 3 days later and asked, gently, if he'd noticed anything unusual that night, Curtis finally exhaled the breath he'd been holding since it happened. "I don't want trouble, Mr. Hartwell. But I've got a daughter. And what if that had been her?" He told Michael everything he remembered. It wasn't proof, not on its own. But it was another crack in the story Victoria had built. And Michael was starting to realize just how many cracks there were once he actually started looking. Victoria, sensing the ground shifting beneath her, changed tactics. She showed up at the hospital unannounced on Grace's 5th day of recovery, dismissing the nurse at the door with the easy authority of someone used to being obeyed, and stood at the foot of Grace's bed with an expression of practiced sympathy. "I just wanted to see how you're healing," Victoria said sweetly. Then, once the door clicked shut behind her, her voice dropped into something else entirely. "I also wanted to make sure we understand each other. Accidents happen. It would be such a shame if your little boy's tuition assistance from the Hartwell Foundation suddenly ran into paperwork issues. Or if finding work anywhere in this county became difficult. People talk, Grace. And I have a lot of friends." Grace, still weak, still healing, met Victoria's eyes without flinching. "You pushed me into a river full of sharks, and you're threatening my son's education from the foot of my hospital bed." "I'm simply saying accidents can happen to anyone. Repeatedly, if necessary." Victoria smoothed her skirt and turned toward the door. "Think carefully about what you say, and to who." What Victoria didn't know was that Michael, delayed by traffic, had arrived just outside the door in time to hear the last 30 seconds of that conversation through the gap where it hadn't fully latched. He didn't say anything. Not yet. He simply turned around, walked back to his car, and drove straight to the estate, to the small, mostly forgotten security office near the boathouse, installed 2 years earlier after an insurance requirement following storm damage. Cameras nobody ever really thought about, aimed mostly at the docks and the property's edge for liability purposes. Including, as it turned out, a wide, grainy, but unmistakable view of the old stone bridge. Michael sat alone in that small office until well past midnight, scrubbing through hours of footage. His stomach in knots, praying he'd somehow misremembered what he'd seen from the garden that night. He hadn't. The footage was grainy, distant, and shot at a strange angle. But it didn't need to be perfect. It only needed to be true. Michael watched Victoria climb the bridge steps alone. Watched Grace arrive a moment later. Watched the brief exchange between them. No argument that the camera could pick up sound for, just body language, Victoria closing the distance fast, hands out, and then the sudden absence of Grace from the frame, the splash a heartbeat later, and Victoria standing motionless at the railing for 11 long seconds before turning and walking calmly back toward the party. 11 seconds. Michael counted them 3 times, sitting alone in the dark security office at nearly 1 in the morning, feeling something inside his chest crack open completely. He thought about the woman he'd proposed to on a beach in Charleston 18 months earlier, the one who'd cried happy tears and called her mother before she'd even said yes. He thought about every small cruelty he'd chosen not to see, comments to waiters, to housekeepers, to anyone Victoria decided didn't matter enough to perform kindness for. He'd told himself more than once that nobody was perfect, that stress brought out the worst in people during wedding planning, that surely underneath it all she was the woman he'd fallen for. The next morning, he called a lawyer he trusted completely. Not the family's longtime attorney, who had ties to Victoria's father, but an old college friend now practicing criminal law 2 counties over. He made a copy of the footage. He documented Curtis's account in writing. He visited Grace at the hospital and, with her permission, gently recorded her own memory of that night while it was still fresh, still exact. "What happens now?" Grace asked him, her voice steady despite everything. "Now," Michael said, "we make sure the truth doesn't get buried the way it almost did. But I need you to know, this is your choice, not mine. You can press charges. You can choose not to. Either way, I'm not letting her anywhere near you or your son again, and I'm not marrying someone who did this. That part isn't up for discussion." Grace was quiet for a long moment, looking down at her hands, at the fading bruises along her forearms from the fall. 6 years I worked in that house," she finally said. 6 years of being talked over, talked down to, made to feel like I didn't matter enough to notice. I'm done being quiet just to keep the peace for people who were never planning to give me any peace at all. She looked up at him, something steady and unbreakable in her eyes. "I want the truth out. All of it." Michael ended his engagement to Victoria Lang on a Tuesday afternoon, in the study of Hartwell Estate, with the security footage playing silently on the laptop between them. Victoria's performance, when she first walked in expecting a routine conversation about wedding vendors, dissolved within seconds of seeing the screen. Gone was the sweetness, the practiced warmth she'd spent years perfecting for exactly this kind of audience. What replaced it was something colder, sharper, and, for the first time, completely honest. "You have no idea what it's like," she said, voice tight, "to watch you look at her the way you never look at me. Do you know how many nights you spent in your study talking to that woman about your father, your business, things you never once brought up with me? I built my entire life around this engagement, Michael. I was not about to let some housekeeper unravel it because you got sentimental. So you tried to kill her. I gave her a push. I never meant for." Victoria caught herself, realizing too late what she just confirmed out loud, her composure cracking fully now. "It was an accident. Got out of hand. I was scared. I panicked. You stood on that bridge for 11 seconds and watched her go under before you walked away," Michael said quietly. "That's not panic, Victoria. That's a choice." The engagement ended that afternoon. Word moved through their social circle within days, the way it always does in towns built on old money and older gossip. Quiet at first, then impossible to contain, especially once the local paper that had so cheerfully printed Victoria's devastated quote ran a far less flattering follow-up after Michael's attorney formally submitted the footage and witness statements to the county sheriff's office. Victoria's family closed ranks immediately, their attorneys moving fast, framing the entire situation as a tragic misunderstanding between 2 women who'd clearly had personal tension over Michael's attention. For a while, it looked like money and connections might do exactly what they'd always done in that town. Smooth the edges, quiet the noise, let time do the rest. But Curtis's statement held. The footage held. And Grace, once fully recovered, sat across from a detective and told her story clearly, calmly, without a single detail out of place, the same steady composure that had once pulled strangers out of dangerous currents now carrying her through the hardest interview of her life. Formal charges were filed, assault, and given the deliberate nature and location, a charge that carried far more weight than Victoria's attorneys had prepared her for. She would eventually face a plea deal that included jail time, a permanent mark on a record that had never held so much as a parking ticket, and the quiet, total collapse of a social standing she had spent her entire life building. Michael didn't feel triumphant when he heard the news. Mostly he felt tired and sad and grateful. Grateful more than anything that the woman shoved off that bridge had somehow, impossibly, survived long enough for the truth to catch up. Recovery, Grace learned, wasn't a single moment. It was 1,000 small ones, stacked slowly on top of each other until one day you realized you could breathe a little easier than before. Michael made sure she never had to worry about medical bills, though he was careful, deliberately, thoughtfully careful, never to make it feel like charity. He set up a trust for Elijah's education that would carry him clear through college, framed not as a gift but as an apology, one that could never fully undo what his fiancée had done under his own roof, on his own land. But it was the smaller things that meant the most to Grace. Michael learning Elijah's favorite baseball team and showing up, unannounced, to a little league game with a bag of gear the boy had been quietly wishing for. Michael asking Grace's opinion in estate meetings and actually listening to the answer. Michael, 3 weeks after the incident, finally asking the question that had been sitting between them since Eleanor's visit to the hospital. "I looked into it," he told her one evening, the two of them sitting on the porch steps of the estate as the sun set gold over the river. The same river, though Grace still couldn't look at that particular bend without her chest tightening. "Your mother, Miriam. My grandfather forced her off this property because she caught him falsifying records, cheating half the tenant farmers who worked this land back then. She threatened to go to the county. He fired her within the week and made sure nobody in 3 counties would hire her afterward." Grace absorbed that slowly. "She never told me any of it." "I think she was trying to protect you from a family that hurt her," Michael said. "And somehow, all these years later, you ended up working for that same family anyway. I don't believe much in coincidence. But I believe your mother would be proud of how you carried yourself here, through all of it. It wasn't a fairy tale moment. There was no dramatic music, no sudden kiss under string lights. Just 2 people who had been through something enormous together, sitting quietly, letting respect grow slowly into something neither of them rushed to name." Grace returned to work at Hartwell Estate 2 months later, not as a housekeeper this time, but as estate manager, a role Michael had created and genuinely needed filled by someone he trusted completely. It came with a real salary, real authority, and something Grace hadn't experienced in 6 years working in that house. Being seen fully as a person whose judgment mattered. The town noticed the change too. People who had once looked past Grace in the grocery store now stopped to ask how she was healing, how Elijah was doing in school, whether the new position suited her. It wasn't that Grace had changed. It was that the truth had finally caught up to what had always been true about her. Her strength, her steadiness, her quiet, unshakable dignity. "You know," Michael told her one afternoon, watching her direct a landscaping crew with calm, easy authority, "I used to think I understood what it meant to build something. I don't think I really understood it until I watched you rebuild yourself." Grace smiled, the kind of smile that no longer needed anyone else's permission to exist. "I had good practice," she said. "Rebuilding is kind of my specialty." A year after the night on the bridge, Hartwell Estate hosted another gathering by the river. Smaller this time, quieter, no orchestra, no 300 guests. Just a modest ceremony to unveil something new. The Miriam Bennett River Safety Center, a small building near the old bridge, funded entirely by Michael, offering free water safety education and rescue swimmer training to kids across the county, regardless of what their parents could afford. Grace stood at the front, Elijah beside her in a small blazer he'd insisted on wearing, watching as Michael spoke about the center, about the river, about a debt he said could never fully be repaid but that he intended to spend the rest of his life trying anyway. Victoria Lang, by then, was serving out a plea deal 2 counties away. her name quietly removed from every charity board and society column that had once celebrated her. Grace didn't think about her often anymore. Healing, she'd learned, didn't require forgetting what happened. It just required refusing to let it define what came after. What came after, for Grace, was a life fuller than the one she'd let herself imagine back when she was 34 years old, cleaning silver on her knees while someone insulted her within earshot of a room full of people who said nothing. She was estate manager now, respected, paid what her work was actually worth. She was, slowly and without either of them rushing it, building something real with Michael. Not out of guilt, not out of drama, but out of two people who had survived something enormous together and come out the other side choosing each other on purpose. And every year on the anniversary of that night, Grace walked out to the old stone bridge alone, just for a few minutes, and looked down at the water that had once nearly taken everything from her. She wasn't afraid of it anymore. The river hadn't defined her. What she'd done afterward, surviving, speaking the truth, standing back up when it would have been so much easier to stay quiet, that was what defined her. If there's one thing this story leaves us with, it's this. The people who work the hardest are so often the ones who get seen the least, until the moment the truth simply refuses to stay hidden any longer. Kindness costs nothing, but cruelty always, eventually, comes due. And real character, the kind that survives dark water and darker people, can't be bought, faked, or pushed under for long. If this story moved you the way it moved me while writing it, that's exactly why we do this. If you believe people like Grace deserve to be seen, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories like this one, and share it with someone who needs a reminder today that the truth always finds its way back to the surface. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next story.